It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative MP and Chair of the Defence Select Committee Tobias Ellwood, Wales's Health Minister Vaughan Gething, the SNP's Drew Hendry and former Conservative Special Advisor Poppy Trowbridge. After a washout bank holiday Monday, can we look forward to summer holidays abroad?
It's right that we only reopen travel overseas when we know it's safe, when we know that we're not going to end up re-importing the virus.
On Thursday, there are elections everywhere of almost every type. We have the lowdown.
I do take full responsibility for these elections, just as I take full responsibility for everything the Labour Party does under my leadership.
Remember this?
We will fix the crisis in social care once and for all with a clear plan we have prepared.
It's now 2 years on. Will Boris Johnson delay reforming social care again? Also,
I believe that it's important to hear young people's voices because it's their future that affects them.
16 and 17-year-olds in England can't vote on Thursday, but those in Scotland and Wales can. Should this change? Let's start with the news that we'll hear more from the UK government and plans for summer holidays later this week, with a traffic light system expected for different countries. The Prime Minister has indicated that some sort of international travel will open up in some way. Let's take a look at some of the front pages which are covering it. The Daily Mirror has "Wish you, EU, were here. Holes boost for Brits." Then The Guardian has this headline: EU to open up to vaccinated Britons as UK urges caution, and this in the Daily Mail. Why wait 7 weeks? And they are looking at the data, which they say is so positive, we should be lifting restrictions even sooner. Well, looking at all of that, my opening question to you all briefly is, why shouldn't people book a foreign holiday now or a trip abroad in the summer? Tobias?
Well, we've got to remember that we're in a unique situation here in the UK. The R rating is falling. The vaccine rollout has been absolutely incredible, one of the best in the world. And that allows us to dare to contemplate relaxing the rules. But just look over your shoulder at what's happening in India, indeed in Germany and France, where they've got another lockdown as well. What we don't want to do is undo all that good effort that we've had over the last number of months, simply to open up our doors and see another variation of the pandemic come to the UK. So we need to be cautious as we take these next steps.
Right, Vaughan, why shouldn't people consider booking a foreign holiday now? Because of the data that Tobias has said, and the EU signalling it will welcome vaccinated Britons and tourists from countries with low rates of infection.
Well, the reality is that we know last summer we re-imported coronavirus into all parts of the UK with foreign travel. And I feel really sorry for people who haven't been able to go away. I love travelling too. But the risks are not just about COVID case rates increasing again, but actually the new variants of coronavirus that are circulating in Europe and other parts of the world. And those may potentially escape the vaccination response. So I understand it's difficult, but it's still the right thing to do to be cautious and to avoid the potential harm that could come if we do have coronavirus imported with all of those additional variants. And on this, I think all four governments in the UK are not a great distance from each other. There's nervousness about looking to significantly liberalise international travel in the middle of May. And we'd like the UK government to continue to remain more cautious than it's otherwise said at other times, because if international travel starts in England, it affects every other part of the UK as well.
Right. I mean, Drew, a cross-party group of MPs have warned that limits on international leisure travel should continue even after the 17th of May, which is the date that people expect some sort of foreign travel to start again. What's your view? Can people book a foreign holiday now? All the data is going in the right direction?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that international travel isn't only about holidays. A lot of families have been separated by this coronavirus pandemic, and you have to feel for them. But I think, and it is a very big but, we have to be very careful, very cautious. We don't want to import the virus, as happened last year when there weren't enough restrictions on international travel. So I think now that we're returning to some freedoms, that we're starting to get back to some semblance of normal, the last thing that we would want to do is put all of that at risk by making rash decisions over international travel at this time. And of course, there is an argument to say that there should be further restrictions on those countries where there are real dangers of importing different variants that we don't know how will react with vaccines into the future.
Right. I mean, Poppy, is the UK government being too cautious, as the front page of the Mail suggests, when it comes to foreign travel, particularly, as Drew said, you know, families have been separated now for over a year?
My family is one of those families, and there are lots of situations that fall in the grey area in between. Business trips that may not be absolutely necessary, but would be helpful or important. And for that reason, and the family reason, and for the sake that we are an island nation economy, I do think we need to move very surely towards more open travel. That means restrictions, but it means really clearly set out guidelines about how to proceed through that process safely. My worry is that we're going to have a lot of up and down, Jo, a lot of volatility, and we're going to see real inequality in terms of what they pay for flights, for example, what they pay for COVID protections, and also in terms of time. If you have a job that only gives you a couple of days off at a certain time, you could be in that group that get hit with those really sky-high prices. So we need actually to move towards a system that is probably going to cost us a bit, but has those costs contained and is very, very transparent, because we have to get moving again.
Are you minded to book a trip abroad, Poppy?
Yes, I am. And actually, I'm minded to go to a place that has even stronger restrictions than the UK, which is Canada, where my family live. And we've agreed to aim for the end of the summer, but be prepared to take a loss. And I think that that's where I need to be able to see clarity on what those costs and quarantine restrictions would be. And I'm sure many people feel that way. All
right, well, it won't have escaped viewers' notice, I hope, if they're regular viewers of Politics Live, that local elections and elections across the UK are happening on Thursday, known as Super Thursday elections. Political correspondent Ben Wright is here to take us through it. And, of course, there are about 5,000 council seats up for grabs. We've got parliamentary elections in Scotland and Wales, mayoral elections, police and crime commissioners, and the Hartlepool by-election. I've left you nothing to say, have I? No,
You've taken all my lines, Jo.
I've taken them all. So high stakes for all the parties.
It's a huge crop of elections, the biggest set of elections clearly since the general election in 2019. And there are even more happening on Thursday because of elections that have been postponed from last year. So, you know, elections that were meant to take place in 2020, like the London mayor, some metro mayor elections, I think some local council elections in England, all those have been shifted to Thursday as well. So it's a massive set of elections. National elections, of course, in Scotland and Wales, they're crucial. You know, I think it's the sixth set of parliamentary elections in Scotland since devolution in 1999. SNP hoping for a majority, potentially huge implications for the UK if they get one, and we start down the path of at least the SNP asking for another referendum. So I think we'll all be talking about Scotland potentially by the weekend. Wales, again, all 60 members of the Senedd are up for election there. Local elections across England, metro mayors, directly elected mayors, police and crime commissioner elections in England and Wales. And one thing which I think will, again, come the weekend, will be gobbling up our attention is a by-election result in Hartlepool, where Labour are defending a seat that is being fiercely contested between Labour and the Tories.
How much will it tell us about the leadership of Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer?
Well, I mean, the backdrop to these elections, of course, is the fact they're happening with Brexit complete, in the aftermath, it looks, of a pandemic. And for Keir Starmer, it's his first proper electoral test since becoming Labour leader. I think for him, it's a big set of elections, and he was conceding that this morning. He accepted that he would be judged on how the party does. And I think really it is that Hartlepool by-election. This is a seat that Labour has held since it was created in 1974. It's up in the northeast of England, where, the story of the last general election, one of the stories was the collapse of the so-called Red Wall. If, and it's a big, big if, the Tories take that seat, I think there will be a lot of questions asked about whether Keir Starmer has put Labour back on some sort of footing that will mean electoral success further down the line. That's why I think that is becoming a really crucial test for him and what the party's appeal is in a part of the country that used to be Labour's heartlands.
Right. I mean, of course, they will argue, won't they, Labour to some extent, that there hasn't perhaps been enough time. There will be a bit of this expectation management that all the parties indulge in the few days leading up to elections.
Yes, and both are playing down their prospects of holding Hartlepool. But it's clear, Boris Johnson, I think, has been to Hartlepool 3 times during this contest. This is a seat that Labour desperately wants to hold on to. But, as Keir Starmer tries to, bring Labour out of the Corbyn years and what was a dreadful result for them in 2019, he's looking for proof that he's on the right sort of track. This morning he was talking about, echoing some of the scale of borrowing and spending that Joe Biden has done in the United States. He talked about 5 big priorities, including preventive public services, new opportunities for young people. He's hoping that some of this is cutting through, and Hartlepool will be one of the tests on Thursday. Right.
Well, Poppy, you're a keen observer of these sorts of things. It's not actually unexpected, is it, to see the management of expectations by particularly the main parties?
No, and the simple thing to do is keep it restrained and aim to surprise to the upside. I mean, if you ask David Cameron or Theresa May or Hillary Clinton, they all perhaps took certain things for granted. Hillary Clinton took Wisconsin and Michigan for granted. She lost both of those. We were all there for the 2017 election, and we all know how Brexit surprised many people. So you're seeing both leaders do the same thing, try to manage expectations down and surprise to the upside. Amanda Milling, who's the chairwoman of the Conservative Party, and the Prime Minister himself, in fact, were trying to say that, they don't take votes for granted and they're going to fight for the seat and it's going to be tough. Keir Starmer's trying to do the same thing, measure expectations down. It'll be harder for him to big up a win because it would be scraping by should he get that result, should that surprise, and then the Conservatives get to run away with it. So it's less about managing into the vote, but it's about what they do coming out of it should the reverse be the case.
All right, and that is all happening, of course, on Thursday. For a roundup of everything you need to know about the elections, use our simple guide, where you can find information on who is being elected and what the elections mean for you. Find it on our website or use the BBC News app. There it is. Now, let's move on to something else. Remember this? Oh, when it comes. I hope you'll be able to...
Good afternoon, and welcome back to Downing Street for an update on coronavirus.
I'll start today, as I always do, by updating you on some of the key statistics in relation to COVID-19.
I thought I'd begin this afternoon by providing some information about how the virus is proceeding within and across Wales.
Recent outbreaks of infection are growing at an accelerated rate in certain areas.
Now, that was, of course, Boris Johnson, Nicola Sturgeon, Mark Drakeford and Arlene Foster speaking at their respective coronavirus press conferences. Let's talk more generally about how governments across the UK have handled the coronavirus pandemic. Can I start with you, Drew? Boris Johnson says that when you look at, for example, British research into drugs and vaccines, the British Army, the NHS, the borrowing power of the Treasury and the UK's vaccine procurement programme, that shows the union's helped Scotland tackle coronavirus. Do you agree?
Well, those are the kinds of things you would expect a government to do. And as Scottish people pay their taxes into the UK Treasury as well, I would expect all of these resources to be used in the same way. The vaccine rollout in Scotland, of course, has been carried out entirely by the NHS in Scotland and other staff members here helped with some of the army, but it's gone fantastically well. And we're very pleased that that's been the case. But
right, but you accept...
This shouldn't be something that's just an exception. I would want any government anywhere to take these kinds of actions.
Yes, but it's more a comparison between being an independent country and part of the union. You accept that buying the vaccines, negotiating the contracts was done at a UK level. That wasn't a power that was devolved to Nicola Sturgeon.
Exactly. Yeah, it wasn't a power that was devolved to Scotland, so it had to be done at a UK level. But To somehow suggest that Scotland wouldn't have been able to do that is a pretty kind of spurious argument. I don't really see how that would hold water. The fact is that it has been, the vaccines have been procured, that they've been distributed, and that's gone well. So that's something to be thankful for. But when you look at the overall handling of the pandemic, there are lots of things that could have been done differently with the powers in Scotland.
And we'll go on to that, because Tobias, on the other hand, the SNP government in Scotland wanted to have more control over, for example, the economic response, the furlough scheme, the level of sick pay, international travel, quarantine rules. Do you accept, Tobias, that the Scottish government's been trying to tackle this pandemic without full control of all the policy levers that they wanted?
Yeah, and you touch on the big challenge that any government faces is what happens nationally or centrally, and then what is devolved down to other levels. Can I just join Drew in commending the work of the armed forces and what they've done and continue to do? I don't think they've been used a lot. The one department that actually does prepare for emergencies and strategic thinking is the MOD, and we didn't use them enough. But just stepping back at this, we talk about a warlike footing when it comes to this pandemic, and in practice that means improved command and control, simple decision-making structures, and improved situational awareness, and above all, clear messaging. And you began this clip by showing how the messaging was changing up and down the country. Clearly, some things are done well from the centre. So PPE procurement absolutely makes sense. But also, because of our structures that we have, operational delivery makes sense to actually bestow that down to those levels. So resilient structures, the emergency response, the four nations, NHS England, taking responsibility for that. But the messaging was confusing and indeed messy. The first lockdown, those rules were very, very simple, but then each nation pursued their own systems, their own levels, their own tiering structures, which became all the more complicated for you, the national media, to actually explain each time of these four types. So we should have a nationally agreed approach, but with a simpler structure to be implemented locally.
All right, Vaughan, you've been responsible for delivering the coronavirus response in Wales. In terms of the powers that are devolved to you, do you think Wales has, though, also benefited from, as we're now talking about, taking part in the UK's vaccine procurement programme?
Well, look, I think that the procurement of the vaccines is one of the areas where the UK government do deserve some credit. I think in other areas of pandemic management, that's rather more difficult. And of course, as you've heard, we're responsible for delivery of the vaccination programme. So we've had to go out and do that and deliver. In the first few weeks, we received a lot of criticism for our approach. We've now got the fastest moving vaccination programme within the UK. The challenge on messaging that Tobias was talking about actually requires all four governments to talk with each other. And that's where there's been a lack of engagement from the heart of the UK government. The Prime Minister hasn't met the First Minister of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland on a regular basis for months and months. And actually, even where the four governments of the UK have disagreed, we've been much better off when we're having a grown-up and constructive conversation about that. And we would be in a better position to both explain where there are similarities as well as where there are differences if that engagement had been different. So that is a point of disappointment.
Yeah, well, you were all nodding in agreement.
It's a matter of fact.
Yeah, well, you were all nodding in agreement to that, including you, Tobias, even though obviously Vaughan was criticised.
I think it's more complicated than that. There were occasions, I can remember a few, and I'm sure you can, Jo, as well, where the Prime Minister is going to give a statement at 5 p.m. and address the nation. And quickly we see Nicola Sturgeon jumping in there, rolling out some new data which applies to the entire country. So politics did play in this. And I'm afraid there was a breakdown of trust in the coordination of the messaging, which simply didn't help. And that confused the people that needed it most. And that's the general population.
Well, Drew, that was true, wasn't it?
People in Scotland know that Nicola Sturgeon was doing these briefings virtually every day, particularly during the most devastating part of the pandemic. She was front and centre doing these things every day, updating people transparently, being that leader that was in touch and speaking to people all the time. So it was just a matter of fact that she was doing this every day. The fact that the UK government and Boris Johnson were doing it sporadically is not the fault of Nicola Sturgeon, who was keeping people informed and trying to make sure the message was consistent and that people did know what to do. And I think people in Scotland have reacted to that very well, and that's why you see our approval ratings so high throughout this pandemic, because they've appreciated that transparency. But to try and say that she was somehow playing politics when in fact what she was doing was playing straight with the people of Scotland is really quite beneath you, Tobias.
Right. Well, on that point, let's look at the outcomes and what they have been, rather tragically, of course, for everybody in terms of the deaths that have happened around the UK. As you know, the Office for National Statistics and other experts have said the most accurate way to compare different countries is to look at whether the overall death rate is higher than it normally is on average. We call it excess deaths. This is the graph that our viewers can see. I'll take our guests through it. This was a big report that they published. Poland has seen the biggest jump in its average death rate, excess death, an increase of nearly 12%, followed by a whole list of other European countries. England is in 7th place with a death rate increase of 7.8%. Scotland is slightly behind England in 9th place, followed by Northern Ireland in 10th place and Wales in 12th place. Now, Tobias, I know you can't see the graphic, but I've taken you through the main figures there. England is in the worst position. It has seen the biggest jump in terms of excess deaths. Do Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party accept responsibility for that?
Yeah, the Prime Minister has acknowledged this, and he's made it very clear there were some errors made at the very, very start of this. We were too slow to implement that lockdown. We were too slow to get the PPE into place, and that's, I think, reflected in those numbers. Where we have picked up and learned very, very quickly is the vaccination rollout. So I think what you're going to see is us emerge from this pandemic in a far stronger position than other nations. So you'll see us move down those charts, and all parts of the country will move down the statistics that you've just read out.
Right, and the same with Scotland, Drew. Just before I come to you, Vaughan, Scotland is in a worse position in terms of excess deaths than both Northern Ireland and Wales. Is Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP prepared to take responsibility for that too?
Well, I think one thing that Nicola Sturgeon has done, as I referred to from the start, is take responsibility for all that's happening in Scotland over this period of time. But as you just pointed out, and I think we have to take a wee aside to say that when we're talking about deaths, we're talking about people's loved ones, we're talking about families who've lost people. So when we're talking about statistics, it's all very well to do that, but we should have an understanding that people have lost people that are very close to them on this. What you've seen from those figures is that the death rate from COVID, according to the UK government's own coronavirus website, is 25% lower in Scotland. How much more could we have done if some of the actions that we wanted to take last year, quicker lockdowns and so forth, could have happened, instead of what we've heard from Boris Johnson about bodies piled high and the reluctance to get into... Well,
remember, Boris Johnson has said that he hasn't said that and he rejected it.
Those alleged comments that witnesses have said they're willing under oath to say that he did say.
Yeah.
Now, I think that is a telling comment about the attitude into things like moving into lockdown. You mentioned earlier that there was dithering over furlough, that we couldn't get the borrowing powers that we wanted in Scotland to act much more quickly on lockdown. That international travel has been a bugbear.
All right.
How much better could it have been if we'd had those?
I tell you, but let's just stick to what we're talking about here, which is excess deaths. I must allow Tobias to come back on what you've said before I go to Vaughan.
Well, it was a more general perspective. It's important that we analyse where we are compared with other countries. But I know for a fact that the standard that other nations are using are different to ours. And it would have been helpful if the World Health Organization had set international standards as to what qualifies as a COVID death. In Germany, for example, if you die of COVID, but you have underlying other problems already, then you do not qualify. That does not count as a COVID death. In the UK, we are more transparent than most nations across the world, as indeed is the United States as well. And I'm afraid that does reflect the data that you're looking at.
Vaughan, do you accept that Wales and every other UK nation has been hit badly, very badly, by coronavirus, albeit to a slightly different extent across the 4 nations?
Yeah, and it's been one of the hardest things going through all these days and just looking at the cases when you start to look at the death rates, as I've had to on a regular basis, and to understand very clearly that those are real people with loved ones, families, and links to others. And with respect to Tobias is wrong, the excess deaths figure doesn't look at the cause of death, it just looks at the extra number of deaths above average. And that probably is the fairest way to look at it. And what we need to reflect on is the previous conversation as well, the learning we've taken from each of the waves and how we apply those lessons in the future with our developing evidence base, because we knew very little about coronavirus over 12 months ago compared to where we are now. And if you look at the choices we made around Christmas and around the lockdown we've all just lived through this winter, I do think we could have made better choices in every part of the UK if the Prime Minister engaged with First Ministers in the other nations of the UK. And I think would have strengthened the response in every part of the UK. Now, I'm proud of the fact that we've done relatively well, but I certainly don't look away from the fact there's been a high level of death and harm caused. We have a huge job ahead of us in COVID recovery.
Yes. I mean, Poppy, you, as I say, were in agreement when the comment was made, I think by Vaughan, actually, at the beginning of this discussion about the governments working together. I mean, how crucial has that been during this pandemic?
This is a community virus, and so I think we need to be looking at it from that end of the spectrum back up. And yes, a lot of the procurement is done at a central government level, but the bottom line is every link of the chain must learn from this, must do better next time. God forbid there's a next time. And it has raised important questions about whether the devolved nations are provided with the powers and the resources, etc. But I think we can all agree there is a chance something like this could happen again. We need to strengthen this system, and we need to remember that the ultimate victim in this are communities. And I do believe that people rely on their local communities for administration in these kinds of crises and information. And so I really think that's sort of where we need to be pumping all of our resources and not playing politics on the central government level, on the supranational level.
All right, well, let's move on to something else, an issue that has taxed successive governments, and that's the issue of social care. I mean, it's been a very difficult year for care homes and their families and relatives in those homes. They've been allowed very little contact. That changes from today. Care home residents will no longer have to self-isolate if they leave the home or go outdoors, whether it's to visit family or friends in outdoor spaces or be in the garden of a relative. We're expecting something on social care in next week's Queen's speech when the programme is set out by the government. But I just want to show our viewers and tell our guests this headline in the Times newspaper, which suggests that Boris Johnson delays social care reform amid cost fears. Let's talk to Charles Tallock from the Health Foundation. He's in Winchester. It's an independent charity committed to bringing about better health and healthcare for people in the UK. Welcome to you. What is the issue, Charles, at the heart of this? Why have successive governments found so many problems with trying to get a solution to social care?
Well, the issues are several-fold, I think. There's obviously the issue which is often discussed, which is people needing to sell their homes to pay for care. But there is obviously also a long-standing issue of underfunding of care. So last year, 2019-20, funding for social care was, in real terms, was pretty much exactly the same as it was in 2010-11. And actually, obviously the population's been getting older. It's been getting larger as well. If you adjust for that, it's about 12% less. So there is a huge problem with just underfunding of the current system. And that leads to all sorts of issues, some of which we saw during the pandemic. It really heightened the issues and the poor working conditions of the workforce and the kind of low pay they get.
Right.
That's the issue of over general funding. But can I come on to the second issue, which I think is the one which people often talk about, which is the social care system, unlike the NHS, even though those two systems need to work very closely together, is a means-tested system. What that means is that if you have assets of more than about £23,000, you will need to pay for your own care. And what that means in extremis is if you go into a care home, you will probably need to sell your house to pay for care. That really creates a problem of unfairness. And it's often talked about, isn't it, that people with cancer get their care free on the NHS. If you have dementia, you will have to pay for your care. And that leads to enormous costs. So the Dilnot Commission said, even back in 2010, that 10% of people will need to pay £100,000 more for their care out of their own pockets. That in other areas, we can insure against those costs. We wouldn't expose ourselves to that kind of uncertainty. In social care, there is no way we can do that. There is no private insurance market, and there is no prospect of there ever being one. That, in essence, is the problem.
All right, Charles, will you stay with us while we open it up to the other guests? Tobias, 2 years ago, as we heard actually in the headlines, the Prime Minister said he had a plan prepared. Let's have a listen.
And so I am announcing now on the steps of Downing Street that we will fix the crisis in social care once and for all with a clear plan we have prepared to give every older person the dignity and security they deserve.
Where is that plan, Tobias?
Well, like so much of government work that was portrayed back in the 2019 election manifesto wasn't able to come to fruition because of the pandemic. You're absolutely right. This was a key plank of the Conservative election manifesto. It's long overdue, as will just be reported. We have an elderly population. It's growing. Different ways of us living longer as well. But successive governments have been in denial about what to do. And the Prime Minister was very, very keen to respond to Sir Andrew Dilnot's report that made it very, very clear that social care was unaffordable. And the Prime Minister wanted to look at ways of making sure that we could cap the actual care costs themselves for any individual to around £45,000. I understand that there are still talks between number 10 and number 11. It will be commented in the Queen's speech, but to the extent in which we'll be able to roll out the original plans as we earmarked in 2019, we'll have to wait and see.
OK. I mean, Poppy, you used to work in the Treasury. Is it about cost, pure and simple?
Yes, 50%. The other 50% is I think that the working age population is not exposed to the problems with social care because it is a relatively new problem that comes out of underfunding of a system that we didn't expect to have to fund. And I do think the pandemic has gone some way towards exposing these problems to the working age population. That will make them more open to solutions. I completely agree. The point a private market solution to this would help, but it is really about a massive shift in attitudes towards funding it. And part of the reason Boris Johnson came in and said that on the steps of Downing Street is because social care was what did for Theresa May in her election. And whether you liked her plans or not, she was trying to do something significant to change the direction of the cruise liner on social care. And we still haven't made any progress on that. But I think it's about everyday attitudes of the working age population who need to take this into account as they plan for a full life that now lasts 20 years longer than they might have expected it to.
Right. Are you worried, Tobias, that it's going to be delayed again, whatever plans there are may or may not exist?
Well, let's see how our discussions between number 10 and number 11 go. But as I say, the Prime Minister is very keen to move forward on this, but we are subject to the enormous fiscal pressures that this pandemic has caused in every single department, the Department of Ministry of Defence, for example, as well. But absolutely, this is an enduring concern that the Prime Minister wants to address. Let's see what happens next week in the Queen's speech.
Vaughan, do you accept that this is a very complicated and difficult issue to make fair and affordable?
Yes, and we've done lots of work in Wales on trying to see a way through. The divide in responsibility, some of which are devolved and others not. And in your introduction piece, of course, the capital limit in Wales is different. It's 50,000. We've got a cap on the costs of care for the weekly charge as well. So there are differences in the way the system works in other parts of the UK. We'd like to have a whole system approach, because what we do for the way that we charge for care, the way we pay for care, will have a direct impact on the benefit system as well, and the way that older people are supported. And the failure to make progress in this will lead to more people living without the sort of dignity we would all want for each other, ourselves, and our loved ones. So we really do need to see progress. I'm afraid that I don't really believe there was a fully worked up plan that the Prime Minister claimed. If there is one, then we really should see it next week. Now, we want to be able to move on with how we pay for care. But if we have to do that in a disparate way across the United Kingdom, we'll get different answers. There'll be more confusion, and the potential that the UK Treasury can end up clawing money back if we want to help people to support them with their care costs in the other devolved nations of the UK. So really big challenges, and the Prime Minister needs to do what he said he would do. Otherwise, people will not just judge him politically, but more and more people, as I say, will live without the dignity that they deserve in their later years in particular.
Tobias?
Yeah, I agree. We need a solution here. We don't want to see people having to sell their own property in order to pay for care. So let's move forward on this. But there's a cost to this. It's estimated to be about £5 billion. Where is that going to come from when we've borrowed record sums already? So as I say, I understand it will be addressed in some form in the Queen's speech, and I'm very keen to see progress here.
Drew?
But that's one of the issues we need
to... Hang on, I'm so sorry, I confused it. Vaughan was just about to respond, and then I'll come to you, Drew. Vaughan?
It's one of the issues we need to talk about is what do people expect from the social care system, and if we want it all to be dealt with by the taxpayer so people don't need to sell their homes, that's one sort of broad answer. If we want people to pay more, then actually your home is your biggest financial asset for most people. We've never had a conversation about what to divide in and what's fair for people of working age and people who expect to be able to pass on an inheritance to their families. There are lots of people that I represent who are really proud of the fact they own their own home and want to be able to pass on a bit of that to their children. But if that's going to be the answer, then you have to do something with more general taxation, because otherwise we're not going to be able to fund the care that we all want to see for people in every part of the UK.
I mean, Drew, that is the problem, isn't it? I mean, there is a philosophical discussion to be had around this issue of social care and what is really fair.
Well, of course, we've had that philosophical discussion here in Scotland for some time, and unlike the rest of the UK, we can see the benefit where Scotland has the power to make different choices here in Scotland, because of course you don't have to sell your house to access social care in Scotland, because that's not a requirement here. There is that dignity for people. And of course we've combined health and social care. And if Scotland re-elects Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP with both votes on Thursday, then we'll bring forward a national care service as well. So those discussions have been held here in Scotland, and we're absolutely miles ahead in terms of providing what is needed for people when they need it most.
Well, of course, you would say that. Charles, listening to the discussion, are you confident and reassured that there is going to be some long-term solution to this in England?
Not confident. I've been working this area for 10 years, and at various stages during those 10 years, I've been optimistic and then had my hopes dashed. Just to say, I mean, there is obviously a solution here on the statute book. So the 2014 Care Act did legislate for the Andrew Dilnot proposals of a cap. That in the time since it was proposed back in 2011, there have been no alternative to that. I think it is still the best solution. It was also proposed at a time of impending austerity back in 2010. So Andrew Dilnot took account of that and basically proposed a system which targeted the resources. So I think we estimate it's about £3 billion a year on those people who need it most. So the people with the highest needs and the people whose needs go on for longest.
All right, Charles.
Targeting protection of those people.
Charles Tallock, thank you very much for joining us. Now, Scottish and Welsh 16 and 17-year-olds will be able to vote on Thursday, but their peers in England can't. So what do teenagers in Leeds think about that?
My name is Henry.
My name is Claire. My name's Alex.
Fergus.
Carmela.
Jaya.
Mariam. I'm 16 years old.
I'm 17.
I'm 16.
I'm 17 years old.
And if I could vote, I would.
I would vote in the upcoming elections.
If I got the chance to vote, I would definitely use it.
Politicians should focus more on climate change, mental illness and institutional racism.
I'd like to see a lot more talk on issues to do with LGBTQ plus identities. I believe that they need a lot more support, and the education needs to be much better.
When we look at the Me Too movement and we look at sexual assault and harassment, there's a premise that it's the girls' fault and that boys will be boys, and I think that local councils really need to tackle this issue and give more education in schools and to the public.
Issues that matter to me the most is mental health, climate change, poverty and homelessness.
I believe that music venues and theatres should all be funded better, considering how much people use these and how much people enjoy them as well.
Mental health, climate change and university fees are very important to young people.
I would also vote on issues regarding the creative arts in schools, as I believe they're heavily underfunded.
Young people do care about what happens in our communities.
Young people will feel more valid and respected in society, knowing that their opinions are being recognised too.
I believe that it's important to hear young people's voices because it's their future that affects them.
By giving us the chance to vote, This means that we can have a say in our country's future.
Tobias, should 16 and 17-year-olds in England be able to vote in elections like these?
Yes, they should. I very much support this move. In Scotland and Wales, they're there already. Other countries around the world are moving that way. Brazil, Austria, Malta, Germany is getting there too. It comes up at every election. When you visit schools, you can get married at 16, but you're not trusted to vote. And studies shows that 16 to 17-year-old age group are actually curious. They're enthusiastic, more so than their 18 to 25-year-old peers. So I think harnessing that enthusiasm and introducing a sense of civic duty to vote, strengthening that bond between the people and the state, I think would be a very, very positive move. Right. I predict that the UK law will change, and I would so much like my party to be the vanguard of that change and, you know, give 16-year-olds the ability to vote. OK,
well, you're firmly behind it. Poppy?
I think I'm a little more old-fashioned than Tobias. I think learning about trade-offs is an important skill that's required if you're participating in the political process. And I think that is something that happens in your late teenage years as you go on to further education, whether it's university or elsewhere, or into work, etc. And I think there is doesn't all have to be black or white, one side of the line. I think there is a period where you're learning about these kinds of trade-offs, which I think makes you much more able to understand the variety that's put forward in any kind of political promise or platform. So I'm not a strong advocate of reducing the age just yet.
All right. Well, I'll get Drew and Vaughan to respond to that. But just before you do, I mean, there are still things you can't do at 16, 17, Vaughan. You can get married, as Tobias says, but with parental consent. You can serve in the armed forces, but with parental consent. You can't purchase alcohol or cigarettes. So justify and defend votes for 16 and 17-year-olds. Vaughan?
Well, I think 16 and 17-year-olds are perfectly entitled to vote. As we've changed the law here in Wales, I think they're mature enough to vote. And the point that Poppy's just made, well, the reality is your view on the different trade-offs of life changes as your situation changes. As a single man, I had a different view on priorities to when I met my wife to when we had children. And as my jobs have changed as well. And I think 16-year-olds do understand a great deal more about life than people who are a few generations ahead of them sometimes give them credit for. And I'm looking forward to 16 and 17-year-olds voting, and I'm sure they'll vote for a range of different parties with a range of different priorities they have. And I agree with Tobias. I think the UK in its entirety is not far off from getting to vote to 16 in general elections too, and that will be a very good thing.
Poppy?
I mean, it's I think back to myself at that age, and I voted at 18, and I didn't feel the need to advocate for it earlier. I totally accept the point that this is where sort of the nations in the UK are going, and other countries as well. I'm afraid, Joe, I just don't think it's an absolutely urgent issue for the UK right now, and I do think. Again, I make the point, learning about trade-offs is an important part of that process of becoming an adult. And I think voting at 18 is part of that process, just like receiving parental consent for those big life decisions, a period of transition. I think it's important.
Right. Well, Poppy's not persuaded. Drew?
Well, I think our best argument you can make for 16 and 17-year-olds getting the vote was in your package when people actually listen to what young people have got to say. And that's the difference when you actually listen to what they've got to say. You can find they are engaged, they're intelligent, they do want to make decisions about their future, which they're passionate about as well. And I'm really proud that in Scotland we've got the ability for 16 and 17-year-olds to vote. It is right, it's their future, and they should have a say in it. So it's absolutely the right thing to do.
So, Tobias, you say you think it'll change. How quickly do you think it'll happen then?
I don't know. My worry is that if we wait and leave it for a Labour government to do, then the Conservatives will be punished for it. And that will be, I think, a political mistake. I would stress, though, that we do need greater political education so everybody is better and more fairly informed. But I would agree, this generation coming through social media is much more engaged than previous generations.
All right, that's all we have time for. Thank you to all of my guests, and I will be back tomorrow actually at the usual time of 12:15 because there's no Prime Minister's questions. Bye-bye.